Hello, Steve. How are you tonight? It's good to see you. I think you're the first to arrive. Okay, what I want to do tonight is there was a rather long contribution a few days back by Tom Hartman in which he expressed an apology from his generation, the boomer generation, but to the millennials and I think the Zoomers as well, because he thought, or he thinks, that the responsibility for what's happened to America, the primary responsibility lies with his generation, okay, of boomers. Now, I'm not quite a member of his generation. I was born in 1939, and that was not yet a boomer year. I was off by 3 or 4 years. Uh, I also don't know if Hartman himself is responsible because I don't think that his politics was ever in line with the Reagan Revolution. Anyway, I thought it would be good to go through what he had to say and to note what I think are uh, some errors in it, omissions in it, and some things that are just not right with it. Hi, Steve Day. So I'll bring it up and we'll go through it. It's a pretty good piece of writing. I don't think it's as good as a piece of writing as the Bob Reich piece was that I went through earlier today. That was really a funny piece of writing, but there was much that was wrong with that. This is a very funny picture of Reagan. I think that must have been photoshopped at some point. A note of apology to this nation's younger generations. We failed you. And this is by Tom Hartman. It appeared in Common Dreams, probably appeared first on Hartman's own blog. And when did it appear? On November 16th. So it's fairly old now, it being the 29th already. Okay. A note of apology to this nation's younger generation. We failed you. Dear millennials and Zoomers, back in the 1980s, a lot of us worked like hell to try to stop the Reagan Revolution. We failed. The next 2 years may be our last chance to save American democracy, our environment, and what's left of the American middle class. When my boomer generation was the same average age as the millennial generation is today, back in 1990, our generation held 21.3% of the nation's wealth. Louise and I shared in that wealth, although we were still in our 30s. In 1990, we owned a profitable small business, our fourth, and a nice home in suburban Atlanta. That was, in fact, the American dream. It was normal then. My dad, born 1928, who worked in a tool and die shop, was able to buy a house, a new car every 2 years, and take a 2 week vacation every year because the middle class in America before Reagan had a pretty damn good life. He retired in the 1990s with a full pension that let him and my mom travel the world. However, millennials today, in contrast, are about the same number of people as boomers were in 1990, but hold only 4.6% of the nation's wealth. And if they're the same age as I was in 1990, they're most likely struggling to own a home, are deeply in debt, and find it nearly impossible to start a small business. Yes, you read that right. Boomers in their 30s own 21.3% of the nation's wealth. Okay. And millennials in their 30s today own 4.6% of the nation's wealth. Just a comment at this point, that is a very, very striking and shameful comparison, and more than hints at the decline of America in terms of what our governments have been doing for our people. And the story for Zoomers is pretty much the same. As a Bank of America research report noted, like the financial crisis in 2008 to 2009, for millennials, COVID will challenge and impede Gen Z's career and earning potential. Similarly, a Stanford University study that looked at Zoomers shows the consequence of Trump's disastrous handling of the pandemic. College graduates who start their working lives during a recession earn less for at least 10 to 15 years than those who graduate during periods of prosperity. What happened? In a word, Republicans. We boomers remember well the Reagan Revolution of 1981, which laid the foundation for billionaires and giant corporations, impoverishing the millennial and Zoomer generations. First, GOP fat cats came for your wages. Those first 2 decades of the Reagan Revolution saw the first major attack on workers' wages since Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed the National Labor Relations Act, giving union members legal protection from physical and economic violence way back in 1935. I have to comment at this point that the National Labor Relations Act, while it did give union members some legal protection from physical and economic violence, isn't really that strong a bill. It's been easy to get around the prohibitions of the NLRA. Also, the penalty for employers who violate the law and the prohibitions in that law have never been imprisonment. They have been fines. They can be damaging to businesses, but they have never been imprisonment. And I have to comment on that. Specifically, when somebody steals from somebody else and is prosecuted, and there's a significant amount of money involved, and the person who steals that money is convicted, that person goes to jail. That person becomes a felon. That person becomes a convict. But when an employer violates the rights of union members, or steals wages, or does something of that sort, the employers doing that do not end up in jail. When they are guilty of wage theft, they don't end up in jail. There are sanctions, there are penalties when they are enforced, and they are enforced much more in Democratic administrations than in Republican administrations. But still, the penalties are not the same. It's as if a generalized theft is considered a very, very serious crime in our society that warrants imprisoning somebody. But wage theft or other offenses against workers that cause them to lose money is not a serious crime. So I think the NLRA has to be amended, and that punishment for violations has to be swift and sure, and the penalties have to be the same as those that are suffered by poorer members of our society who commit outright theft at the point of a gun. In 1990, the end of the first decade when millennials were coming into the world, Republicans were still just getting started. 56% of workers who applied for union representation got their union. That wasn't as good as during my dad's generation. 80% of workers got a union when they petitioned for one in the 1940s, but it was still a far cry from what the millennials and Zoomers are facing today, as giant trillion-dollar corporations employ the billion-dollar union-busting industry that didn't exist in 1980 to keep them from having democracy in the workplace. And to comment again, that is a particular sphere of struggle that is constantly going on, where employers are doing illegal things to stop workers from having democracy in the workplace. That's another area where heavy sanctions and penalties are needed for employers who act like that. Why isn't Jeff Bezos in jail? Why isn't Howard Schultz in jail? In large part, this is because right to work for less laws that allow employers to gut their unions began spreading in a big way in the 1980s and 1990s. The notorious Taft-Hartley law that gave states the legal ability to destroy union rights was passed over Harry Truman's veto in 1947. But the National Right to Work Committee wasn't formed until 1995. I have another question to ask. Okay, the Republicans had Congress in 1947 and 1948. That's when they passed Taft-Hartley. When the Democrats got back control, which was in 1949 and 1950, why didn't the Democrats immediately repeal Taft-Hartley? They had control at that time. Of course, there was the filibuster to overcome, But then they had the standing filibuster. You had to keep it going. In 49 and 50, there were not enough Republican votes to block a repeal of Taft-Hartley. Why didn't the Democrats do that? After Jack Kennedy was elected in 1961 and 1962, why did not Jack Kennedy do that? After the landslide victory of Lyndon Johnson with huge majorities in 1965 and 1966, why wasn't Taft-Hartley repealed back then? What I'm saying is Democrats had all kinds of chances to repeal Taft-Hartley during the 1960s. And also parts of the 1970s. The Democrats had enough votes in Congress and the Senate during the 1970s to repeal Taft-Hartley then. They had enough votes when Bill Clinton came into office why haven't they repealed it? The notorious Taft-Hartley law. In every single case, anti-work or right-to-work for less laws have been passed in states controlled by Republicans at the time of passage. Democrats fought these anti-worker laws from the beginning and continue to do so. Even at the state level, though, I'd argue not very hard, because there are a lot of state legislatures controlled by Democrats, or that had been since that time. And, well, I may be unjust in this. I don't know off the top of my head whether there were any states where Democrats gained control and where they fought to actually repeal the right to work laws in those particular states. I know that here in Virginia, from time to time, since the 1990s, there have been actually many times where Democrats controlled the state legislature and also the governorship. And they never got rid of those right to work for less laws in Virginia. Nonetheless, employers have big bucks and can continue to buy a lot of elections and politicians. What started as a trickle in the 1950s has turned into a flood since the Reagan's presidency. Today, right to work for less laws or states include Arizona, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Idaho, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Iowa, Kentucky, Michigan. Yeah, right to work for less laws got passed in Michigan after the Democrats lost control there sometime in the 1980s. Louisiana, Mississippi, Nebraska, Missouri, Nevada, North Dakota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Dakota, South Carolina, so many states. Tennessee, Utah, Virginia, Texas, Wisconsin, and Wyoming. Then they came for your right to an education. Before Reagan became governor of California, the entire University of California system was free. The entire public system. The very best schools, some of the very best schools in the country, that were state schools, were free. Reagan did away with that as governor, and then as president began the methodical process of eliminating federal and state support for tuition, saying he didn't want to, quote, sponsor the intellectual curiosity, unquote, of, quote, brats, unquote, who quote, protest my policies. He took away the right to an education because he wanted to punish people who disagreed with him and would protest against his policies. That's the respect for democracy that Ronald Reagan had. By the way, in my view, Ronald Reagan was a brat himself. I went to college briefly in the late 1960s, and the only person I knew who had college debt was a friend working on his graduate degree, okay, at MSU. I paid my tuition, working part-time jobs as a dishwasher at Bob's Big Boy on Trowbridge Road in East Lansing, and changing tires and pumping gas at the Esso station across the street. And by the way, I should comment here that I was very lucky also. I didn't have any college debt because my parents were able to afford to send me to Cornell. And even though things got a little thin for them somewhat later, I was able to work at Cornell during the summers right on campus. Okay, I waited. Okay, I worked as a dishwasher, uh, but I was able to support myself during the summer while I was staying there. And so I graduated from college with no debt, and I went to graduate school on assistantships, okay, and fellowships. And my parents did not have to support me all during that time. And when I graduated with my PhD, the only debt that I had was for the new car that I bought when I learned that I was going to get a job. Well, actually, two jobs: a job at a research corporation doing government contracting work at $12,500, and another $3,750 a year job uh, for teaching one course at the State University of New York, okay, at Buffalo. That salary, of course, in 19, when was that? I guess it was in 1966, was able to support me, and I was able to buy a spiffy sports car. My mom, says Tom Hartman, paid her way through 4 years of MSU in the 1940s, with the money she made as a summer lifeguard up in her hometown of Charlevoix, Michigan. I think that's how they pronounce it. The French pronunciation is Charlevoix, but I doubt they say it that way in Michigan. My dad, like most men of his generation, was paid to go to college by the GI Bill. Now, Republicans have not only changed the bankruptcy laws so that you are no longer cleared after 7 years like it was when I was coming up, but you can't even discharge student loans in bankruptcy. This was arguably one of the largest gifts of the GOP ever gave the banking industry's billionaires. It certainly was. After that, they went after entrepreneurs and local businesses. I dropped out of college in part because the small business Louise and I had started in 1969, an electronics repair shop across the street from MSU, had grown to 5 employees and I was making as much money as my dad. Back then, pretty much every business in East Lansing was locally owned, from the restaurants and hotels to the furniture and clothing stores and appliance shops. The only chain store I remember was the Sears that anchored the local mall. I remember that Sears. I used to shop there sometime during the 1960s. Almost all the rest of the stores in that mall were locally owned. I guess I should have mentioned I got my PhD at Michigan State University in East Lansing. But then in 1983, President Reagan ordered the federal government to stop enforcing the antitrust laws. To stop enforcing the antitrust laws. When did it happen that the presidents of the United States were given the authority to stop enforcing certain laws that were passed by Congress? Now, I know that the Attorney General's office, Department of Justice, has to have some discretion because you cannot prosecute everything. But you order the federal government to stop enforcing the antitrust laws, and you get away with not being impeached? What's wrong with that? Remember that through most of the Reagan administration, the House was still controlled by Democrats. The Republicans didn't take over until 1995. This was the period of constant Democratic control of the House. And for much of the Reagan period, they had control of the Senate too. Why wasn't there an attempt to impeach Reagan for not enforcing the antitrust laws? Congress didn't repeal those laws. The resulting, quote, merger mania consumed the American economy with merger and acquisition artists. And speculative banksters like the one Michael Douglas played in Wall Street were ascendant. You remember, greed is good. Gordon Gekko, greed is good. Buying up small businesses and crushing them together into giant conglomerates, shedding excess employees, quote unquote, and employing economies of scale, quote unquote, were the main way to make money instead of serving customers and local communities. All that, of course, is right, but you have to ask, where were the Democrats in control of Congress for much of that time? Where was Tip O'Neill when he made a deal with Ronald Reagan to raise Social Security taxes on people, Social Security contributions to nearly double those contributions, so that Social Security wouldn't run short of money? When Social Security had never run short of money per se, because Congress just appropriated more money when the trust fund ran out. There was no reason why they couldn't have kept just appropriating more money. But Reagan sold a BS bill of goods to Tip O'Neill, and he stood for it. He stood for it. The dumb Democrat didn't just say to Reagan, look, we're going to appropriate more money for Social Security, and if you don't like it, you'll see what happens in the next election. Instead, he levied nearly twice as much tax on myself and many other people to fix a problem that didn't exist. Now, there are a number of times already that I've indicated one of the main problems with this particular piece from Tom. And that main problem is that Tom puts all this blame on the Republicans, and they certainly deserve all the blame he's putting on them. But no blame is put on the Democrats in office whose resistance was extremely weak to be as charitable as possible to them. In many cases, they bought the austerity BS and they collaborated with Reagan through the time he was in office. Then they collaborated with Clinton through the time that he was in office and voiced the same kind of austerity BS. And then they often collaborated with George W. Bush. People like Joe Biden, that banking act of the early 2000s. Democrats collaborated while all this was going on. Maybe you want to blame this on the boomer and zoomer, the boomer generation, on the Republicans and the boomer generation who failed people. But this had as much to do with Democrats caving like a cheap suit that it had to do with the whole generation of boomers. Yes, they bought into greed was good, quite a lot of them, but not all of them, not most of the boomer generations. Those who bought the Wall Street BS, yes. But I don't think the majority of boomers was in on this. I don't think they're guilty as a generation. I think a lot more guilt has to be placed on the Democrats who were chosen to represent them, to be Democrats, to be the successors of Franklin Roosevelt, and who all through the 1980s caved. And then when a Democrat came back into office, he and they caved some more. And then they started taking the big Republican money and they were bought. And generations of people in Congress were bought. And Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat after all, served those donors very, very well and made stock market deals for herself all the way along the line and became filthy rich while offering only token resistance, kabuki resistance to the Republicans. Tom doesn't want to say this because Tom, in the end, is a vote blue no matter who guy. And I understand he doesn't want to weaken, the Democrats and get a fascist like Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis in there. I know that very well. But you still got to tell the truth. You got to keep the pressure on. And you got to act for the people. Buying up small businesses and crushing them together into giant conglomerates, shedding excess employees and employing economies of scale were the main way to make money instead of serving customers and local communities. Now their absolute market dominance and greed are driving out of control inflation as the normal competitive pressures that keep such behavior in check are dead. And they enthusiastically squash new upstart businesses from tech to retail to consumer goods like bugs. And why does that go on? Again, it's because the people, starting with Reagan, decided not to enforce the antitrust laws. Now, again, I have to refer to the Clinton administration. Clinton did not enforce the antitrust laws either. Either. Both parties had abandoned the antitrust laws, to give him a little credit, until Joe Biden came into office and hired some regulators who intend to enforce those laws once again. Thank God, because there are no free markets without the government regulating those markets to ensure that they stay competitive and they stay free. Free markets are not markets without regulation by the government. They are markets that have to be well regulated by the government, or you get economic concentration. Look at what recently happened with the pandemic and the CARES Act. The CARES Act was designed to keep large and rich companies in business, while the pressures created by the pandemic drove smaller business out and increased concentration even more and created an even greater antitrust problem that we are suffering from now that we're trying to recover from the pandemic. And people knew this was happening when the CARES Act was passed. And remember, the CARES Act was passed with the full cooperation of the Democrats, who controlled the House during the COVID crisis. Nancy Pelosi didn't give a damn about increased economic concentration, perhaps because she was so intent on profiting from it herself. There are a lot of people who blame the inflation we're having now on the dominance of MMT, that it was belief in MMT that you could spend a whole bunch of money that created the inflation. But these were not MMT-based policies. They were policies passed by people who were afraid, wanted to spend a lot of money to try to stop a depression from happening, and who gave no thought to controlling inflation, who gave no thought to controlling economic concentration. Economic concentration arises out of not regulating, and one of the consequences is inflation, because the more economic concentration there is, the more price gouging there is. And the chief factor in this inflation, the chief factors have been supply chain difficulties, which in part were created by overconcentration. And in addition, of course, the price gouging itself. Those are the two main factors in creating the current inflation we see now. Only 8% of that inflation was attributable to wage increases. So here is the Federal Reserve trying to drive the labor market into the ground and stop the inflation that way. They're only aiming at 8% of the problem. And they expect that's going to solve the whole problem. Only recently have there been some faint signs that Jay Powell may be ready to start to turn around and end this silly and non-productive attempt to create a recession with these interest rates, not even knowing that the interest rates themselves have been feeding the inflation. There are some recent articles that have appeared on this as well. Thus, your chances of being able to successfully start a business like we did are tiny compared to what they were before the Reagan Revolution, when literally tens of millions of Americans owned small enterprises that they would hand down from generation to generation. And they started squeezing you for cash when you got sick or injured. The burden of medical debt is another one that came out of the Reagan Revolution that destroys millions of American families a year. For 500,000 families every year, it's so severe, they have to give up their homes and positions to declare bankruptcy. We are the only country in the world, the United States, that experiences medical bankruptcies like this. When Louise and I started that electronic shop as teenagers, we were able to provide all of our employees with full medical insurance because at that time, both insurance companies and hospitals were required by law in Michigan and most other states to be nonprofits. Drug companies weren't the monopolistic monoliths we see now. It was an incredibly competitive industry, and pharmaceutical prices were reasonable too. The country wouldn't have tolerated asses like, quote, Pharma Bro, unquote, back in the 1960s and 1970s, and insulin, which only costs pennies to make, was dirt cheap. But the neoliberal Reagan Revolution did away with all that, encouraging states to change their laws to bring, quote, free market principles to healthcare, ending nonprofit requirements. There was, after all, big money to be made, and when somebody is sick and you hold the cure, you have the ultimate power to extract every last penny they have. Remember the article I recently covered about the cost of enzalutamide these days? $2,800 a month for enzalutamide. $2,800 a year is too much. As the New York Times noted in an article titled Medical Mystery, Something Happened to U.S. Health Spending After 1980. Quote, America was in the realm of other countries in per capita health spending through about 1980. Then it diverged It's the same story with health spending as a fraction of gross domestic product. Likewise, life expectancy. In 1980, the U.S. was right in the middle of the pack of peer nations in life expectancy at birth, but by the mid 2000s, we were at the bottom of the pack. Yep, not only did the parasites get rich, but our nation's life expectancy actually went down compared to other wealthy nations. Now, as the Kaiser Family Foundation reports, we find that 23 million people, nearly 1 in 10 adults, owe significant medical debt. The SIPP survey suggests people in the United States owe at least $195 billion in medical debt. And if the GOP didn't nail the millennials and Zoomers on any of the above, they figured out how to go after your need for a roof over your head. In the 1990s, as part of Newt Gingrich's notorious contract on America, quote unquote, Congress deregulated, quote unquote, the financial industry to the point that it's become a giant blood-sucking leech attached to your backs. You should have said our backs. Thus, millennials and Zoomers are struggling with housing costs today, and for good reason. Trillion-dollar hedge funds and investment groups are purchasing as many as half, in some towns more, of the available for sale housing, so they can turn them into rentals, and then when they've cornered the market, jack up the prices. When my dad bought his home in the 1950s, the median price of a single family home was around 2.2 times the median American family income. Today, the Fed says the median house sells for $374,900, while the median American income is $35,805, a ratio of more than 10 to 1 between housing costs and annual income. 2.2 to 1, up to 10 to 1 between housing costs and annual income. Louise and I bought our first home in our mid-20s, as did many of our friends. Banks were locally owned and worked with you. Finding fixer-uppers was easy. No more. As noted in a Wall Street Journal article titled, quote, "Meet Your New Landlord, Wall Street," unquote, in just one suburb of Nashville, Spring Hill. Quote, "In all of Spring Hill, 4 firms own nearly 700 houses, which amounts to about 5% of all houses in town," unquote. This is the tiniest bit of the iceberg. On the first Tuesday of each month, notes the Journal article about a similar phenomenon in Atlanta. Investors, quote, "toted duffels stuffed with millions of dollars in cashier's checks made out in various denominations so they wouldn't have to interrupt their buying sprees with trips to the bank," unquote. The same thing is happening in cities and suburbs all across America. The investment the Goliaths use fine-tuned computer algorithms to sniff out houses they can turn into rental properties, making over market and unbeatable cash bids, often within minutes of a house hitting the market. After stripping neighborhoods of homes young families can afford to buy, they then begin raising rents to extract as much cash as they can from local working class communities. In the Nashville suburb of Spring Hill, the vice mayor, Bruce Hull, told the Journal, used to be able to rent a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house for $1,000 a month. Today, the Journal notes, quote, the average rent for 148 single-family homes in Spring Hill, owned by the Big Four Wall Street investor landlords, was about $1,773 a month. So why did those prices go up, folks? Concentration, economic concentration, allowing economic concentration, not regulating economic concentration. As the Bank of International Settlements summarized, one of the centers and focus of neoliberalism, summarized in a 2014 retrospective study of the years since the Reagan-Gingrich changes in banking and financing. Quote, we describe a Pareto frontier along which different levels of risk-taking map into different levels of welfare for the two parties pitting Main Street against Wall Street. We also show that financial innovation, asymmetric compensation schemes, concentration in the banking system, and bailout expectations enable or encourage greater risk-taking and allocate greater surplus to Wall Street at the expense of Main Street. It's a fancy way of saying that big banks and hedge funds are now worth trillions while you and your economy are destitute. And forget about getting a loan to start a small business in this pink bag environment of today. When Louise and I started our first business, we did it with a $3,000 loan from a small local Michigan bank. Back then, bankers were part of the local community and eager to do what they could to help the community grow and prosper. Nowadays, they just want to extract every penny they can from you so their CEO can buy another mega yacht. And then Republicans came for your wealth in a huge way. Finally, perhaps the most important of the reasons that millennials and Zoomers are so badly screwed these days are the various changes in our tax code that began in the 1980s. Reagan dropped the income tax rate on the morbidly rich from 74% down to 27% and cut corporate tax rates from 50% to functionally nothing. Okay. America's richest millennial, Mark Zuckerberg, owns fully 2%, or 1/50th of all the wealth of all the millennials in the country. The average billionaire pays an income tax rate of under 3%. And the majority of our nation's largest corporations not only pay nothing in annual income taxes, but most have so gamed the system that they get money back. And where does that money come from? It's taken out of the taxes the government collected from you and me. Well, not really, but that's another story we have no time to tell right now. This 42-year-long process with Reagan's original massive tax cuts amplified by trillions more in tax cuts for the morbidly rich from the Republican George W. Bush and Donald Trump administrations has produced a $50 trillion transfer of real wealth from the middle class to the top 1%. You read that right. They've taken 50 friggin' trillion dollars out of our pockets over the past 42 years and stashed it in their money bins. While Reagan was elected, there wasn't a single billionaire in America. Now they're appearing like popcorn, while all around us homelessness spreads like a relentless fungus, destroying the lives of millions of Americans, particularly millennials and Zoomers. The bottom line, my dear millennial and Zoomer friends, is that you've been had by the GOP. And now that Republicans have handed all that money over to the top 1%, and 5 corrupt Republicans on the Supreme Court ruled in their 2010 Citizens United decision that billionaires and corporations owning politicians isn't corruption or bribery, but, quote, free speech. It's getting harder and harder to do anything about it. Every time any sort of reform, even modest, reasonable reforms, come before Congress, A united bloc of Republicans in the Senate haul in another $1 billion in campaign contributions, and Mitch McConnell and his friends kill it with the filibuster. And don't get me started on climate change, which Republicans right across the board continue to deny deference to the fossil fuel industry and its billionaires that funds their elections. They've put money and power above the fate and future of your and your children's planet. They even tried to end our 240-year experiment in democratic self-governance and are now actively embracing neo-fascist autocracy, openly trying to emulate the right-wing strongman governments that have taken over Russia and Hungary. Like Russia and Hungary, they've succeeded in overturning the right to abortion in the states they control and openly embracing homophobia and misogyny. Did I mention over 400 million guns drenching our company in blood? And Republican Senator John Cornyn recently saying that Republicans are unified across the board to prevent any further action to stop gun violence in America. By the way, in Around the World with Brandy and Dee, I'm sorry, in my 9 o'clock live stream, this was actually last night, a panel of Brandy Weaver, uh, um, but Dolores Pierce, uh, and Greg Mallard, okay, and I, after discussing, okay, at great length what we could do to stop further gun violence, okay, in America, we concluded that to do that, we had to stop working directly on laws to stop gun violence in America, but instead, what we had to do was to implement the idea of dump the corruption and vote against every single legislative candidate and incumbent who was getting or taking any of the big money. And that after that, what we had to do, only after that, what we had to do was to go after the filibuster. But we needed that change in the Congress first to go after the filibuster and then to do all the other things we need to do, including pass legislation to stop gun violence here in America. I'm so embarrassed to have to say this, says Thom Hartmann. My generation let this happen. Back in the 1980s, huge numbers of boomers voted for the Reagan Revolution that kicked off this whole political and economic death spiral. The guilt is largely ours. I guess I can't just stop here. I have to say that the Carter administration prepared the way for the Reagan administration. Now, I love Jimmy Carter personally. I think he was and is a man of great integrity, bless his soul. But I also think that he was responsible for Paul Volcker and the high interest rates of the late 70s that helped to drive him from power. Without Paul Volcker and the rise of those interest rates by the Fed in an attempt to kill off the inflation, which was purely a supply side type of oil inflation, without that, Reagan never would have won in 1980. And without that, it also would have been the case that the energy revolution that was being pursued by the Carter administration would have continued right through the beginning of 1985 at least. And by the way, the economy would have recovered under Carter as soon as the inflation ended. And the inflation would have ended with the deregulation of natural gas that Carter passed. Those natural gas supplies were coming online and were replacing Saudi oil. And the Saudis were getting ready to cut prices so they could sell their oil again. But Paul Volcker cut all that short and killed the economy with his high interest rates. And as he did, the economy became a big issue. And Reagan was able to capture the Reagan Democrats, the part of the working class that turned to the Republicans to do something about the inflation that they saw happening, which they attributed to Democratic policies. Going on. And now these Republicans are trying to marinate your children in their white supremacy and racism. I like that. Marinate your children in their white supremacy and racism by forcing teachers to push a false narrative about American history, all while they try to rig our elections by purging millions of minority, millennial, and Zoomer voters from the rolls with the 2018 blessing of a corrupt Supreme Court. The good news, however, is that increasingly older and younger generations are working together to throw Republicans out of office and elect progressive Democrats who understand these issues and know how to do something about it. From 80-year-old Senator Bernie Sanders to 25-year-old progressive Democrat Maxwell Alejandro Frost, who just won a House seat, progressives are growing in political power. At the same time, America is waking up from the fog of bullshit Republicans have been crop dusting over us since 1981. All is not lost. Change is in the air, and millennials and Zoomers, as we saw in last week's election, are leading the way. Get out there. Get active. Tag. Wear it. And the only thing that I would add to that at this point, get out there. Get active in the movement to dump the corruption in both parties, in both the Republicans and the Democrats. Get rid of all the incumbents and all the challengers taking big money. Vote only for people who use small dollar donations to fund themselves. And if you, the millennials and Zoomers, help us to do that, we can bring in Congresses that will change things, that will get rid of the filibuster, that will safeguard the vote for everyone, that will also turn to meet climate change and pass Medicare for all, and pass the elimination of student debt, and do all the various things we have it in our power to do to prosper again and to save the earth and our children and grandchildren. So get out there, get active, tag, wear it. So there we go. I hope you like that. I will take a few of your comments. And let's see. Steve Day says 1946. Kay Ryan says hi, Joe and Steve. Steve Wolfbrand says hi, Kay. Around the world with Brandy and D. Hi, everyone. Kay says hi, D. Steve says hi, Dolores. Steve Wolfbrand says smash the like button. Yeah, I always want to say that myself. I never do. Smash the like button, please. Reagan killed unions. Yes, he did, because all the union movement did not fight. When he went after and he got those air traffic controllers, every single union in this country should have struck in sympathy. There should have been a general strike at that time. The union response to that was weak. It was weak. That is the truth. Kay says RTW sucks. Steve Wolfbrand says, right to work is right to be a slave. Yes, Steve. Kay says, I had friends that went to California for a free college education. Yes, there were a lot of people who did that then. By the way, college educations in New York City used to be for free at one time. CCNY, Queens College, also Brooklyn College, they were all free. Even when tuition in the state of New York was not free, in the SUNY universities. Steve Day says, yes, universities of California pre-Reagan. Steve says, I went to UCLA. It was not free, but affordable. Steve says, I did the dishwasher thing as well. Yes, I worked in the hotel school at Cornell, washing dishes. Brandy Weave says, hello, everyone. Kay says, hi, Brandy. Steve Day says, merger mania, ugh. Steve Wolfbrand says, ironically, Reagan was the former president of the SAG union. I know, Screen Actors Guild Union. Yes. Yes, he was a union president when Franklin Roosevelt was the president of the United States. He was a Democrat. Reagan started out as a Democrat. He started out as a union man. He started out as a Franklin Roosevelt fan, you might say. Then he went to work doing commercials for 20 Mule Team Borax and Boraxo. I forget what the damn company was called, but they paid him a lot for those advertisements, and he was out of screen work, so he took it on, and it made him a fortune. And from then on, he became a right-wing bastard. And Steve Day says, a beer party is better than any political party. Yes, it is, Steve, but unfortunately, a beer party lasts a lot shorter time than any political party. Steve says, we need to look forward, not backwards. Steve, you're kidding me. We need to look backwards to understand the mistakes we made and not make them again. And we need to look forward as well. That slogan is one of the ones that I really hate. It was Obama's excuse for not doing anything important. We need to look forward, not backward. Crazy. Steve Day says, go home, Pelosi. No pay, go. Steve Wolfman says, Doc, look what they did to JFK and RFK and MLK and Malcolm X. And don't forget Fred Hampton. And Steve says, and Fred Hampton and Gary Webb and Seth Rich. Okay, Steve, you got it. And Kay says, Clinton's ruined, Kay, the Democratic Party. They did. They did. But Nancy Pelosi helped every step of the way. She helped.
Her husband.
And Richard Gephardt helped too. Steve Day says, a U.S. president, Hollywood actor. Dang. Steve Day says, the best thing about currency is circulation. Bottoms up. Lana Day shared. And Steve Day says, virus bats last and permafrost thawed. Hi, Lana, says Steve Wolfbrand. Hi, Lana, says Kay Ryan. And Lana says, hey, Stephen K. My company bought 4 new trucks, but we can't use them without camper shells, which are 4 months backed up in the supply chain. We are F's. He says, effed, sorry. And Kay says, I worked in not-for-profit healthcare, way worse now. Steve Wolfbrand says, our port in Long Beach is finally caught up, but the lockdowns in China don't bode well. Yeah, I know. Brandy Weaver says, hi, Steve. Sorry, I am floating around. Steve says, hi there, Brandy. And Lana Dell says, 50 trillion. Wow. Brandy says, it was a good show, Joe. Thank you, Brandy. Kay says, yes, a very good show. Steve Wolfman says, Hartman, meh. Now, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that about Hartman. I really like Hartman. Okay, I like him a lot. I don't like the fact that he will not blame Democrats when Democrats need to be blamed. That I don't like about him. But he's often much more forward than other people in identifying problems and also in finding solutions. There were only 2 people who years ago were talking about Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, which allows the Congress to restrict the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The 2 people were me and Thom Hartmann. And I don't know which of us was first. But Thom Hartmann was right there, and he gave it a lot of attention, including in one of his books, and he's pushed it ever since. And I thank him for that. That's a very, very important thing that he talked about. Steve Wolfman said, Jimmy Carter, great person, lousy president. I tend to agree, except in one area. He was very good in the energy area, in looking for new sources of energy, researching new sources of energy. He was very good. Steve Wolfbrand said, I still love Jimmy, though. Yeah, me too. Kay Ryan says, very good show, Joe. Thank you, Kay. I certainly appreciate it. Well, everybody, thank you. That is me today. I did a show this morning. I think a pretty interesting one. I did another show at 4:30. With Lila Charles Lee. I think that was a very fun show. I participated a bit, in Around the World with Brandy and Dee, at 8 o'clock tonight, but not as much as I would have liked because I really needed a nap very badly before that show. And now this one, I feel great. It's been a great day. I'll be back tomorrow with 3 more shows. There's one thing I have been doing. I have been deliberately avoiding the more controversial aspects of foreign policy for empowering democracy. I'll explain that to you. My most important of all the priorities I've talked about is the dump the corruption priority. And I don't want that campaign to be disturbed by controversy over telling the truth in foreign policy. There are some very good people out there who are telling the truth in foreign policy. And I think my voice is needed now more in the area of the dump the corruption campaign and trying to build that particular campaign. Because there's Scott Ritter, okay, and but Douglas McGregor, okay, and there's the Duran people and Brian Barletic, and lots of other good people who are telling the truth about our foreign policy, okay, at this point. And so I am not needed there. If I was, I would be there. Where I'm needed is in the dump the corruption area, and that's where I'll spend most of my time. But I will help with Brandy and Dee's program to try to get them going as best I can, because they're doing some very, very valuable stuff. So please don't forget my Patreon account, patreon.com/Joe_Firestone, and my Buy Me a Coffee account, which is at buymeacoffee.com/Joe.Firestone. Please occasionally stop off there. Steve Wolfbrand says, tough to watch while I'm working, Doc. I understand, Steve. But the videos are there afterwards. Brandy Weaver says, we love having you. Well, thanks, Brandy. Okay, I love being there supporting you. Okay, well, good night. I'll try to get to bed early tonight. And having Madeline, yeah. Yeah, Madeline's doing a great job. An absolutely great job. So good night, everybody. And good night to Dee, who does a great job for all of us and has now been doing a lot of research as well. It's great to be working together with all of you.